Some Nebraska corn growers have noticed insect damage this season in very particular situations from what could be an uncommon pest. The environments are all similar in that they feature corn which was planted green into a rye or wheat cover crop. Nebraska Extension personnel believe wheat stem maggot is the cause of the injury, but you'll hear in a minute why they can't yet definitively confirm that thought. Nebraska Extension's Justin McMechan joined us Monday to further describe the issue.
May 30th, we got a few phone calls on producers that had rye cover crops or wheat cover crops that they green planted corn into. And initially when we got the calls, they were saying they were seeing dead heart symptoms. So some insects were being isolated from these. They weren't sure what they were. So we went out to those and saw a range of damage from 2 to 30%. But essentially we were finding these little maggots in these plants. And so we brought them back and we've been dissecting those plants and trying to determine what's going on.
Can you further describe the damage in those fields?
Yeah. So initially when we got out there, I mentioned the dead heart symptoms, but then later, when we were back about 2 weeks later, we were seeing this excessive tillering. And these plants really hadn't grown much. They remained pretty stunted. And so a lot of more calls started rolling in then because it was evident from the field what they were seeing. Initially, these were some keen consultants that were seeing just the first signs of what was happening.
And what do you see when you bring them back to campus here?
Yeah. So it's a lot of fun trying to isolate wheat stem maggots, or what we think is wheat stem maggot, from these plants. But basically, we cut the plants open, and we would find these maggots almost all the way down to the growing point, below the soil surface, so 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface. They're into that growing point, and they're more or less burrowing it out and feeding on it. And the result is the plant more or less loses that center. But it appears after they reach kind of their 3rd or 4th instar, they're moving back up the plant to complete their development, possibly in these corn plants. We have a lot of unanswered questions.
So what is the wheat stem maggot?
What is the wheat stem maggot? So the wheat stem maggot is commonly found in winter wheat fields, and in fact if a grower is out in a field, and typically this time of year it's getting harder to tell, but they'll see these white heads in the field. Worked in western Nebraska for a couple years, and this is usually pretty low in number, 1% or so. We get up to 5%, I'll get a call from a grower. But it's a minor pest, really, in winter wheat. So this was a little bit surprising to find it in corn.
Describe the situations and the areas of the state that you notice this.
Yeah, so initially we were getting calls just from south central Nebraska, and lots of cases we were getting out to these fields, and it was confined literally to where the cover crop was. But then we started getting calls from other parts of the state. We posted this on Twitter, and as a result, we had a lot more people calling in. And so it seems like it spread kind of through south central, through the eastern part of the state in a number of distinct geographic locations. But within the individual field, sometimes we just had a grower plant just a slope of the field with a cover crop. And so not the whole field planted, of course. And it was literally right to the edge of where the cover crop was. That was where the damage was. Outside of that, the plants were fine. So it's pretty clear to identify the cover crop association with it.
Any history of this whatsoever?
We've got reports from 2005 and 2015. Wayne Onesorg, an extension educator, actually took some documentation of it in 2015 on a single field that he was seeing it in. He followed the plants through to development. They didn't produce any grain. They more or less look like a non-competitive plant. National Crop Insurance Service would give that designation to those types of plants. And we're tracking plants on these. We're seeing a little bit different symptoms than what Wayne was seeing, and Wayne did rear out adults and identified them as wheat stem maggot, and that's why we're being a little bit cautious with these because our symptoms are slightly different. Wayne said they were exiting or entering the plant almost at below the soil surface near the first node, whereas we're seeing them actually come in through the top and burrow their way down the plant. So it's possible it's environmental related on why that's occurring if we're dealing with the same insect. But the symptom of development seems similar after a little while.
Will you clarify why you're saying if we're dealing with that, or why it's hard to?
We're being a little cautious because this particular family of flies is really hard to identify as an immature, and we have Jim Kalish here on campus who's an expert in insect identification, and he cautioned us to wait until we get some adults out for emergence to make sure that we're dealing with the same thing. We want to be really sure what we're dealing with so that when we go into future studies we know what we're working with.
Management options? No
management options this year. So this has been a tough conversation with growers. These fields, as I mentioned, got up to 30% in some cases. Nothing they can do. And I know there's a bit of revenge out there because of the small insect is causing all this damage. But they've already done their damage within those plants. We don't expect them to move between plants. We actually expect the adults will complete development and leave the fields. Corn is not listed as a host for wheat stem maggot, but there was some seed treatments that were used in 2015 on one of these affected fields, and from the low treatment all the way through to the highest ones they didn't see any response. So there's a lot to learn. We did get some reports of producers using some chemistries, but because the infestations were so low, we can't clarify that that's actually working or not. So we're hoping to set up stuff actually at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center at ARDC to actually test out some of these methods and clarify whether or not that might be a valid method of control. I really recommend to growers going into next year to terminate these crops 2 to 3 weeks in advance, the rye cover crop or wheat cover crop prior to planting corn. It's unfortunate in the eyes of what people want from cover crops, which is they want to grow them right up to the last minute. So hopefully we can provide some management options if they run into those types of situations in the future.